Hello, everyone. This is another one. I've done one for a while, but I was basically waiting for some books. So I'll be basic on the presentation on this book, which is the revision of the English version of the New Testament by Lightfoot, Trench, and Ellicott. And Lightfoot was part of the revision of the English version of the King James. And it's an introduction by F.H.A. Those who know the history of the Christian Church. Uh, this one here, it's called the English Revisors Greek text. And this one, it talks about the other point of view. It's by G W Samson. And also we have here is Scrivener's Introduction to Criticism of the New Testament, yeah, Volume 2, 40th revised by Reverend Edward Miller. Now, the reason why I've used these particular books as references is because these were contemporary scholars at the time of the revision of the authorized version. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go into in terms of how the critical texts, specifically Westcott and Hort and Nestles, had the ascendancy and replaced the Textus Receptus. So basically, a perfect storm. We talk about in terms of the rise of the Textus Receptus, which came out of the Byzantine tradition. So I've done previous videos on that, so feel free to look on those previous videos. So we had paper coming to Europe. I think initially it was Spain when paper first came through their Spain's connection with the Muslim countries. The invention of the printing in the 15th century, the fall of the Byzantine Empire in the 15th century. And the reason why that was important because the Greek manuscripts began to come across into the West. So in the West, it was predominantly Latin was the language, and the Latin Vulgate was the main Greek New Testament. So you also have a revival of learning Greek. There was a revival in learning the Bible in its vernacular languages, the Greek and the Hebrew. So we have Erasmus, the two key people in the Textus Receptus. Erasmus, he was probably the greatest scholar of his time. He would visit all over Europe, get readings from all over Europe of manuscripts. And one of the things where Erasmus and Beza, etc., have been criticized is that they use corrupt late manuscripts, which is not necessarily the case, which is definitely not the case. And the reason why I say that is that, for example, Erasmus relied mainly on the known as the Byzantine manuscripts, were quite homogeneous. So, for example, if I have 10 manuscripts from that group, it represents about, say, 2,000 manuscripts. Yeah. So, for example, there's a group of manuscripts called KR. Those, Wilbur Pickering, he talks about Family 35. If you take 10 manuscripts, they have a 98% agreement. So, if you take 10 manuscripts out of them, they represent 200 manuscripts. So to say he used few manuscripts is not exactly true. It's definitely not true. And I would also add that they were late. Now, I've done a presentation before. Have a look at that, about that late manuscripts does not necessitate late readings. So what we find with the discovery of papyri, we find early readings in these papyri, which go way back. All right, so we've got Erasmus and Beza, Thomas Beza. Now, Beza's edition of the Textus Receptus was the one used primarily for the translators of the King James. So I thought I'd spice up, put nice pictures there. We've got Stephanus. Now, Stephanus is really, a lot of scholars use Stephanus edition as the standardized Textus Receptus. And we have Presbyter Scrivener. Scrivener is very important because he was not only compiled the underlying Greek text behind the King James, right, by comparing various Greek editions, the Cosmopolitan edition. He compared the Beza, he compared Erasmus. So he'd look at all this about, I think it was about 18 printed Greek New Testament, I think it was, right? So that can be corrected anyway. But Stephanus, a lot of people say Stephanus, some people say Scrivener is the standard TR. So a lot of scholars, when they compare TR readings, they normally use Stephanus. But those who are Textus Receptus only, they would say the F.H. Scrivener edition is the mature edition of the Greek New Testament. And there's very, I'm just at this point, there's very little differences between the editions, very minor differences in the editions, very minor. None of them really make any impact doctrinally, and they're very minor. So, and even the the critical edition scholars would say there's very little difference between the editions. So, this little thing there, we've got Erasmus, then we have Stephanus, Robert Estienne, SDN, Theodore Beza with his various editions, Eliza, Scrivener, and Scrivener based his printed Greek New Testament on Theodore Beza's. Now, the interesting thing with Scrivener's annotated Greek New Testament, it shows the differences between the Westcott and Hort and the Textus Receptus. So the annotated Greek New Testament, not the one that is produced by the Trinity Publishing House, right? What happens is that they have this annotated one, which I believe the Dean Burton Society produced, and that shows you the differences between the Westcott and Hort Greek Testament and the sort of Trinitarian publishing, right? So they produced the one that we're used to, was the Textus Receptus, but the Dean Burton Society, I believe they're the ones who produced the annotated Greek New Testament, which shows the difference between the Westcott and Hort and the Textus Receptus. So we've got coming to Westcott and Hort, right? Westcott and Hort, they spent 30 years, and I've done previous videos about these two gentlemen. One is actually from Moseley in Birmingham, Midlands, and so that's where he lived in Moseley. And both of these men spent, which was unusual, just for those who like to do a bit of research, is that they took 30 years to produce their Greek New Testament. And it wasn't the fact that they looked at various editions, they looked at manuscripts themselves. They actually worked from printed Greek New Testaments. So there's nothing wrong with that. Scrivener did that. So they work from printed Greek New Testament, Tregelles, Tischendorf primarily. But I've gathered they also, Luckman is another one they looked at as well. So these are Westcott and Hort, very influential men. And these two men, the Greek New Testament, as influence modern Greek New Testament in terms of Nestles, land, etc. And we'll see why. But what this presentation is how it became dominant, how it overtook the Textus Receptus. Yeah. So we've got Samuel Products Tregelles and Constantine von Tischendorf. Right now, Tischendorf, where he's famous because he discovered the Codex Sinaiticus, and he based his edition primarily on Codex Sinaiticus. So Tregelles, the Cornishman, he was supposed to be on the revision committee, but because of his health, he had really poor health. He never got to make it, but they still used his Greek New Testament. So Tregelles, Cornishman, very influential, and he was supposed to be on the committee, but his health stopped him from having that. Right? So these two men are very influential in terms of printed edition of critical text. So Westcott relied primarily on Tischendorf, Luckman, and Tregelles as their most critical modern predecessors. And the reason why they use this because they had what they call a critical edition. So they had references to the manuscripts they actually used. And they also consulted older TR-based editions, Stephanus, Beza, also Mill, Wittgenstein, Buchenbach, and Klotz. They just represent a decisive move away from the Textus Receptus tradition. And they what they call the neutral text, grounded mainly in Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. Now, they, especially Tregelles and Larkman, their focus was early manuscripts. So one of the things, the criticism of the Textus Receptus will use medieval manuscripts, old manuscripts. But as I said before, in a previous presentation, Old manuscripts doesn't mean old readings. So I would encourage you to look at that previous video where I gave it two clear examples. One particular example where there was a reading found not in the majority text or British tradition, it's in the Textus Receptus, but was found in only Codex Sinaiticus and the exact word order. Yeah. So even though the manuscripts were relatively late, they contained early readings. And this was a mistake that scholars make, and they made at that time, that old manuscripts contain old um, old readings. But this has been disproved by the discovery of various papyri, and I've dealt with that in previous presentations. So here's the rule. So basically, let's give a background to this, is that we have the King James Version, right, the authorized version. And what happened is that the committee of the Church of England decided to do a revision of the authorized version, the translation, right, of the authorized version. So the rules of the British Committee. Now, here's the thing, that Westcott and Hort was part of that committee. Scrivener, I could name all the people that were on that committee, which could be useful. The New Testament Company was Right Reverend Alfred Lee, Professor, oh no, that's the Revisors. Yeah, the English Revisors was the Bishop of Winchester, Bishop of Gloucester, Bristol, Bishop of Salisbury, Dean of Westminster, Reverend Dr. Scott, Dean of Rochester, um, Canon Blakesley, um, Archbishop of Dublin, Bishop of St. Andrews, Dr. Angus, David Brown, Professor Eady, those who know about Eady's comments on the New Testament from the Greek text, um, F.H.A. Hort, Humphrey, Reverend Canon Kennedy, Archdeacon Lee, Canon Lightfoot, from whom this book is written, and Professor Milligan, Professor Moulton, I believe he does his about the Greek New Testament, Professor Newth, Professor Roberts, and the controversial one is Dr. G. Vance Smith, who was a Unitarian. He didn't believe in the Trinity. He didn't believe in the Nicene Creed. So his appointment was very controversial, but that was through Westcott and Hort who brought him on the panel. And the famous Dr. Scrivener, Dr. Tregellis, but he was too ill to take part. Dr. Vaughan, Master of the Temple, and Canon Westcott. And the secretary was Troutbeck, Reverend J. Troutbeck. Yeah. So, but at the same time, we had an American committee, which F.H.A was part of that. Now, the rules of the committee was generally, the general principle was to introduce as few alterations as possible in the text of the authorized version, consistently with faithfulness, to limit as far as possible the expression of such alterations, the language of the authorized and earlier versions. Those who know about the authorized version use the Bishop's Bible for Tyndale was the basis of the authorized version. So they use other translation versions, such as the Bishop's Bible, etc. Each company was to go twice over the portion to be revised once periodically, second time following the principle of voting as hereinafter is provided that text to be adopted and be that for which evidence is slightly preponderating, and that when the text differs from that from which the authorized version was made, the alteration was indicated in the margin. Yeah. So really, the rules of the British Committee was basically, which was basically to make a new King James version, which didn't happen till another 100 years. So the rules was really to work on the translation, not the Greek texts, which underpinned the authorized version. So this was the rules of the committee. And generally, when you have rules, you follow rules, don't you? Right? So the rules of the committee was basically to work on the translation. Let's look at further. So the Bishop of St. Andrews, who was part of the committee in his late charge to his synod, states as his own impressions of the Revisors' work in its progress. So this person, um, uh, Bishop of St. Andrews, he was part of the committee. He said, the more I saw the work, the more it appeared to me that we were going beyond the purpose for which, as I understood it, we had been appointed, going further and citing omissions like that of the doxology of the Lord's Prayer, thou art the kingdom, the power, and the glory, Its form was used in all branches of the Christian church except the Roman, which is the Catholic. As part of Christ's words, the Bishop of St. Andrews declares, I'm unable to discover, this is what he said, I'm unable to discover any actual consensus of scholars to demand the changes that have been made. So there was almost like, you almost get the view there was almost confusion amongst the 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 um the panel, because in terms it was quite clear, which I've just read, that it was supposed to be a revision of the King James, not the Greek text. So let's go a bit further here. Yeah. All right. Uh, Now the English Revisors, the Greek text. So this is the vision here. It says to be careful students of the history of the New Testament. Precept of the Revisor once hinted that the first object was a revision to receive Greek text rather than receive English translation. So basically, so there are certain members on the panel saw it as an opportunity to work on the Greek text and therefore impact the translation. So he says, so let me read that again. To the careful students of the history of the New Testament, the priests of the Revisors at once hinted first object was a revision. And this is what you find in terms of this particular book by Lightfoot, Trench, and Ellicott. Yeah. So, which is the revision of the English version of the New Testament. So they saw their remit was to revise the Greek text, not the translation. And what you find is numerous omissions were made. So it says, which missions were justified only by a class of manuscripts, ancient indeed and valuable as relic, but have the following peculiarities as every testament of their admirers, as well as their original possessors show. So basically, it was marked by omissions, right? And what you find, it was a Greek text that was never used in the church worldwide, the ancient church worldwide. And this is one of the issues and the questions I always have. I said, well, why wasn't these like Vaticanus and Sinaiticus valued by the church? Why wasn't Codex Vaticanus held in the Vatican Library? Why didn't it influence the Vulgate? It didn't influence the Vulgate one bit. Why didn't Sinaiticus influence the manuscripts that was found in St. Catherine's Monastery? It didn't. So those two manuscripts were never used as exemplars and never widely copied. So it seems that modern scholars have a higher value than the scribes and the monks who did this all day, for most of their life. That they didn't seem to want to copy from it, but yet we found it and says, yeah, these are the one scholar say, yeah, this is nearest to the true text that we have. So Philip Schaff, right? He does the commentary, the introduction in this book, the revision of the English version of the New Testament. He said the text restore from the best critical resources now made accessible an older and purer text in the place of the comparative late and corrupt Textus Receptus. In other words, substitute the New Testament an ante-Nicene for a medieval text. So that was his understanding, and he became part of the American Revisor. So the American Standard Version. So he was part of that committee, working closely as an observer of the English version committee. Yeah. So the Americans didn't have any influence, but they were observers at the process. So they understood, their understanding that the Textus, which was there for 300 years, the coming out of the Byzantine tradition, which was used by the church in its preaching, in its liturgy. We see the lectionaries, we see in the preaching by the quoting of the early church fathers, and the manuscripts. All of a sudden, it's decided by modern scholars to be a corrupt text, and therefore it needs to be replaced. So they're introducing a Greek text that had never been used before, not in the lections, not in the preaching. Um, uh, so they decided it was corrupt, therefore need to be removed. But here's the thing: the Western New Testament um, jumped on the back of the revision of the authorized version, which was supposed to be strictly a revision of the translation, not the Greek text. So can you imagine for a moment that you're there and you've been invited to be part of a committee, and this is the rules, these are terms of reference, and you go beyond that by going further than the terms of reference. George Salmon. Now, George Salmon was a mathematician. He was a friend of, I think it's Westcott or Hort, but he was a contemporary. And in his book, he says, I return from the digression of the subject of which I've been speaking. The convenience arises in the fact that Westcott and Hort's results became known sometime before the public had the means of knowing the process, which is talking about the introduction. So Westcott and Hort, when they preached the Greek New Testament, preached the introduction, and they preached the Greek New Testament. So the introduction tells you how they got to the Greek New Testament. So basically, the translation came first, and it said, by means of post-Bible sequence arrived, the company of the New Testament revisers were indeed privately supplied with installments of Westcott Hort's Greek text as their work required them. But that text did not come into the hands of the public till a little after the appearance of the Revised English Testament. And those who took offense at the omission or alteration of certain familiar phrases or texts to wait some time longer, up to a couple of months, before they had an opportunity of learning Dr. Hort's introduction, the principle by which the work of text revision had been conducted. Now, my argument with this is this: you were given terms of reference, but you privately began to share this Greek New Testament, which wasn't part of the process. Yeah. So in a sense, I've said this is like coming through the back door, so to speak. So these are some of the letters, Life and Letters of Brooke Foss Westcott. And this is from his son. He had a diary. So he said, Professor Lightfoot, for Lightfoot was part of the committee, my dear Lightfoot, ought we not to have a conference before the first meeting of the revision? So it was like a bit underhand, really. This is my opinion. There are many points which it's important that we should be agreed. The rules, though liberal, are vague, and the interpretation will depend upon decided action at first. I'm a fiction, I've been absent too much already, but Hort is ready to come here on any day, and the trains are convenient. Can you then fix some time when you could also spare a few hours? We shall hardly want more for a conference. There really seems hope for the New Testament, NT at least. Ever yours, BF Westcott. So basically, there was a bit of underhand business here that based on they perceive laxness of the rules, we see an opportunity here to promote our New Testament. So more Westcott to the Reverend F.J.A. Hort, 1st July 1870. The original on the whole surprised me by prospects of hope. I suggested to Ellicott a plan, yeah, all right, of tabulating. And so I said, see, Life of Archbishop Toll, circulating emendations before our meeting, which in the end proved valuable, ever yours affectionately. So when this revision was first mooted, I said, and Ellicott is also one of the writers in this book here, is that he sees an opportunity now, before he's seen the rules, to promote the Greek New Testament. George Van Smith, very controversial man. He was he actually refused to take Lord's Supper with some of the company. He was a Unitarian, did not believe in the Trinity, did not believe in Christ being the Son of God or equal to God. And it was Hort, Westcott and Hort, who got him onto the panel, and it caused a great controversy at the time, a big controversy. So it is, I think, it difficult to measure the weight of acceptance won beforehand, but for the revision by the single fact of our welcome and Unitarian, if only the company perseveres in its present serious and faithful spirit. And this is very, very controversial. When you look at in terms of the Textus Receptus, it's mainly Catholics and Protestants were involved. But we have a man who denies the Trinity. Anyway, that I don't need to say any more than that. So what I did, I did a chat GPT, like a scenario applicant. So if they didn't write on the back of the revision of the authorized version, and I put in a note, ChatGPT used mod technology. If Westcott and Hort had not been on the revision committee, their addition might still have been respected, but probably would have been just one critical addition among several like Tischendorf's. Their theories, especially the neutral tests, and the primacy of Vaticanus Sinaiticus might have spread more slowly and faced more resistance. They would not have had the same immediate practical impact on the English Bible readers, pastors, and churches. Which I would totally agree, because there's numerous, like Tischendorf for a critical text was better. Tregellis was better. I know that Tyndale Abuse, Dirk Yonkin, his Tyndale Greek New Testament is based on Tregellis. But what you will see is that a Greek New Testament doesn't reach the ascendancy unless it can be translated using the basis of, popular translation. So let's look at that, yeah? So it wouldn't have got anywhere really, because Tischendorf was better. Tregellis was better in terms of critical edition. These men had familiar with manuscripts, but it went nowhere. And this is probably the impact, the issue with the Byzantine manuscripts based on that tradition. So your Family 35, your Robertson and Pierpoint, and your majority text, your Hodges and Farstad, and even the various critical editions, SBL, the Michael Holmes, because unless they become a base of translation, they just become a Greek text. Yeah, that's used for scholarly purposes. But Westcott and Hort understood that their Greek New Testament would never become mainstream unless it got on the back of a translation. This was a beautiful opportunity for them. Let's see also how Nestles came to their tendency. So 1898, Eberhard Nestle, so eventually son and the Alans, their Greek text, which is used today. He said, published the first Nestle's Greek New Testament, blending Tischendorf, Westcott and Hort, and Weymouth text. So what he did is that he used Westcott and Hort Greek New Testament, Tischendorf, and when they disagreed, he would use Weymouth's Greek text as the arbiter between the disagreement. He published his most important work, Novum Testamentum Graecae, cum apparato critico ex. I don't speak Latin, by the way. So the Greek New Testament with a critical apparatus collected from editions and manuscripts. So I'll just read the English here. Right. Now, how did it become dominant? And there's a really interesting article. And I was trying to find this on the internet, but I didn't realize I actually had the book with the article. In one AK article, The Life and Work of Eberhard Nestle, in 1898, the Württemberg Bible Society in Stuttgart. So you had local Bible societies, but the main was the British and Foreign Bible Society. So in 1898, the Württemberg Bible Society in Stuttgart published anonymously a pocket edition of the Greek New Testament. Within a few years, the anonymous editor was identified on the title page of a new edition as Eberhard Nestle. Right, so that's from the book, The Bible as a Book, the Transmission of the Greek Text. So basically, what he did, he went through, in a sense, the local Bible Society. He published it through the Württemberg Bible Society, but he didn't put his name on the front page. All right, so it was published anonymously as a pocket edition of the Greek New Testament. Now the problem is, it was, if it was going to be translated, it would be translated in German, but the main language was English at the time. So it would have been localized, yeah? So how did it get to be the basis where it actually literally overthrew the Textus Receptus? Because the main publisher of Bibles was the British and Foreign Bible Society, which later on became United Bible Society. So let's look at that. So shortly after the anonymous publication of Nestle's Greek New Testament, a positive review of the work was published in the Expository Times. It praised the book for, among other things, overcoming the supremacy of the Textus Receptus and for a more modern critical edition with manuscript evidence in footnotes. The review concludes by saying that would be the best reward for the great expense which the Bible Society of Stuttgart had spent if other societies would make larger use of it. So the Expositors Times was the probably main ones for Bible scholars, all right? So what happened is, it was, so after the anonymous publication of the Greek New Testament, right, there was a review written. So it's like me writing a review of my own book, right? And just to add that I do have a book out, the Textus on the Milan text, shameless plug. All right. So what you see here, there was a review. He reviewed his own book, all right, and saying, would it be a great thing, I'm paraphrasing now, that this was adopted by other Bible societies? So he published it in 1908. And at the time, the British and Foreign Bible Society used the Textus Receptus as the base for its translations. The glowing review of the anonymous Greek New Testament was written by none other than Nestles himself. In 1904, 6 years later, the edition was then adopted by the British and Foreign Bible Society and then became the basis of every modern translation. Yeah. So, as I did, ChatGPT on, and what would have happened? He said most Protestant Bible translators of the 20th century, especially in missionary context, must continue to be as a base. So basically, if Nestles hadn't done that, right, through his anonymous Greek New Testament and his anonymous review, I said, what would have happened if he didn't get into the British Foreign Bible Society? And it said most Protestant Bibles of the 20th century, they would continue to use the TR rather than the critical edition. And this would have delayed the global acceptance of the modern critical text tradition. This was a land United Bible Society. Nestle's edition gained authority because it was practical and widely printed. If the British Foreign Bible Society had ignored it, British scholarship might have remained confined to the academy without shaping everyday Bible printing or translation. Right? So part two. The United Bible Society formed 1946 struggles without a common base text. Catholic and Protestant Cooperation Translation Project is limited, and it never gains global dominance. Critical editions remains mainly as an academic tool rather than a translation standard. All right. So I said, am I being reasonable? If you look at all these Greek New Testaments, they haven't really gone anywhere. All right, they've fallen out of use. So I just to add as well that the Westcott and Hort, the English Revised Version, was never popular. And so it was through the Nestles and the British Reformed Bible Society that we have modern Greek text, how it's become dominant. And it's going to the mainstream now. The question is, to ask yourself, right, was it being straight how they got in to become a dominant text? Westcott and Hort used the revision of the translation to replace the underlying Greek text. Nestle offers himself to his local Bible Society and then writes a glowing review, and then it's later adopted in 1904 as the main Greek text for the British Foreign Bible Society. Okay, I hope you've learned something, whether you agree with me or not, but at least it stirs up your pure mind and something you can study later. God bless you. God keep you. May cause his face to shine upon you.